It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
When most people think about Paul McCartney, they picture the charming Beatle with his melodic bass lines and boyish smile. They remember him as the songwriter who wrote Yesterday and helped change popular music forever. But behind his polite and cheerful public image, Paul McCartney had strong opinions about other musicians. While he always kept a diplomatic face in public, people close to him saw moments when his politeness cracked, showing sharp criticism of bands that didn't meet his high standards. Paul could be brutally honest about music, as former Wings guitarist Denny Laine revealed in a rare 2018 interview. Laine explained that there was always competition between him and Paul, a friendly rivalry where each would try to come up with something better than the other. Paul knew exactly what he liked and what he didn't, and he wasn't afraid to say it when they were alone. Throughout his career, McCartney had heated arguments during the British invasion era and made dismissive comments about punk rockers who challenged his musical legacy. His private opinions about certain artists showed a competitive side that most fans never saw. These musical feuds weren't just about personal problems. They reflected deep disagreements about artistic direction, songwriting philosophy, and what rock music should represent. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles versus Rolling Stones rivalry defined a generation, but fans didn't see how personal it became behind the scenes. While they maintained what looked like friendly competition in public, McCartney repeatedly took subtle shots at the Stones throughout his career. During a late-night recording session at Abbey Road in 1968, McCartney allegedly told producer George Martin that he always thought the Rolling Stones were just a blues cover band that got lucky. While this comment never made headlines at the time, Paul's feelings leaked out, but in more measured ways over the years. In a 2021 New Yorker interview, McCartney couldn't help himself when discussing the Stones. He said he wasn't sure he should say it, but they were a blues cover band, and that's what the Stones were. He felt the Beatles cast a wider net than the Stones did. Mick Jagger quickly responded, calling the Beatles a four-piece band with one drummer while joking that the Stones were still filling stadiums. The root of Paul's dislike seemed to come from what he saw as the Stones' lack of originality. Former Apple Records executive Peter Brown revealed that Paul always felt the Stones were following in the Beatles' footsteps, releasing similar album concepts months after the Beatles had already explored that territory. Even more telling was McCartney's reaction when John Lennon briefly considered producing a Stones album in 1969. According to studio engineer Jeff Emmerich, Paul was visibly annoyed, questioning why John would waste his talents on them when the Beatles had their own projects that needed attention. While McCartney occasionally praised specific Stones songs, the competitive tension never fully disappeared. When Rolling Stone magazine asked about the rivalry in 2016, Paul's diplomatic answer still had an edge to it. He said they were a great band, but they just weren't the Beatles, were they? The Sex Pistols. If there was one musical movement that really bothered Paul McCartney, it was punk rock. No band represented that rebellion more than the Sex Pistols. When this anarchistic group emerged in 1976 with their raw, aggressive sound and anti-establishment message, McCartney was reportedly angry about their deliberate rejection of everything he had helped build. Linda McCartney's brother, John Eastman, revealed in a rare 2003 interview that Paul considered their music an assault on his ears. He couldn't understand why anyone woo. You'd celebrate not being able to play their instruments properly. The feeling was mutual between the bands. When the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen climbed the charts during the same week McCartney's Mull of Kintyre was riding high, Johnny Rotten publicly dismissed Paul as a dinosaur who represented everything punk stood against. What truly made McCartney angry wasn't just their musical approach, but their direct attacks on his legacy. According to Wings drummer Denny Seiwell, Paul was particularly hurt when he heard the Pistols were using Beatles posters for target practice during rehearsals. Seiwell recalled that Paul tried to laugh it off, but you could tell it bothered him deeply. The tension reached its peak when both acts found themselves recording in neighboring studios at London's AIR facility in early 1977. Studio manager Dave Harris remembered that Paul made a friendly gesture to introduce himself, and apparently Sid Vicious muttered something about establishment sellouts. McCartney turned around and never acknowledged them again. Years later, McCartney would grudgingly admit that the punk movement had cleared the air in music, but he never warmed up to the Sex Pistols specifically. During a 2016 BBC interview, when asked about the band, Paul simply replied that they weren't really his cup of tea, with a tightness in his voice that revealed his true feelings. Oasis, the Britpop phenomenon of the 1990s, saw Oasis emerge as self-proclaimed Beatles disciples, with Noel Gallagher openly worshipping McCartney's songwriting. You might think this admiration would flatter Paul, but behind closed doors, it apparently had the opposite effect. McCartney's longtime publicist Jeff Baker revealed that Paul found their Beatles obsession tiresome and borderline insulting. He felt they were reducing his life's work to a handful of copied chords and recycled melodies. What particularly annoyed McCartney was Oasis's cocky attitude combined with what he saw as unoriginal music. During a private dinner in 1997, Paul reportedly told George Martin that they had the swagger right, but where was the innovation? He pointed out that the Beatles never just copied their heroes, they transformed them. The tension wasn't helped by the Gallagher brothers' notorious outspokenness. When Noel claimed in a 1996 interview that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles, McCartney was furious. According to Beatles biographer Philip Norman, Paul called such comparisons ridiculous and privately dismissed the band as arrogant newcomers with half the talent and twice the ego. A particularly awkward encounter happened at the 2000 Q Awards when both McCartney and Oasis were receiving honors. Backstage, Liam Gallagher apparently approached Paul for an autograph, only to receive a surprisingly cool response. One witness described McCartney as polite but clearly uncomfortable throughout the exchange. Over the years, Paul softened his stance somewhat, occasionally acknowledging Oasis's impact on keeping guitar music relevant. However, those in his inner circle maintain he never quite got over what he saw as their shameless stealing of the Beatles' sound. When asked directly about Oasis in a 2018 GQ interview, McCartney offered a tellingly brief response. Good songs, but he wished they'd found their own voice. The Monkees. Few bands drew McCartney's quiet scorn quite like the Monkees. While the world saw them as harmless entertainment, Paul allegedly viewed them as a cynical corporate exploitation of everything the Beatles had pioneered. Beatles assistant Alistair Taylor revealed in his memoir that Paul considered them a plastic imitation. He would change radio stations whenever their songs came on during car rides to the studio. The Monkees' manufactured origins particularly bothered McCartney, who had spent years developing his skills in Hamburg's clubs before achieving fame. During a heated discussion with Brian Epstein in 1967, Paul reportedly said they were making a mockery of what the Beatles had built, 4 actors pretending to be a band, which was insulting. The tension escalated when the Monkees TV show began incorporating psychedelic elements after Sgt. Pepper's release. According to George Harrison, McCartney viewed this as blatant theft. Harrison recalled that Paul would get properly wound up about it, saying they were following the Beatles' blueprint without doing any of the work. A particularly awkward moment came at a Los Angeles party in 1968 when McCartney reportedly snubbed Mickey Dolenz by walking away mid-conversation. Dolenz later recalled that he didn't think Paul ever accepted them as legitimate musicians. Despite the Monkees eventually fighting for creative control and becoming a real band, McCartney's opinion never fully changed. When asked about them in a 2011 interview, his diplomatic response still carried an unmistakable edge. They had some catchy tunes, but they were certainly no Beatles, were they? The Bee Gees. The disco explosion of the late 1970s saw the Bee Gees achieve unprecedented success just as McCartney's post-Wings career hit a rough patch. This timing created what insiders describe as simmering resentment from Paul toward the Gibb brothers. Producer Chris Thomas recalled that Paul felt blindsided by disco. Here were these 3 brothers suddenly selling more records than the Beatles ever did with Saturday Night Fever, and he took it personally. McCartney's frustration allegedly came from what he saw as the Bee Gees' transformation from Beatles sound-alikes to disco superstars. According to Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber, Paul would listen to their falsetto harmonies and mutter about how they'd abandoned their original sound for commercial gain. The rivalry intensified when both acts were recording at the same Miami studio in 1979. Studio manager Tony Bongiovi remembered that Paul would schedule his sessions to avoid running into them. When someone mentioned the Bee Gees had broken into other chart record, he visibly tensed up. What particularly bothered McCartney was the critical acclaim they received. When the Bee Gees were hailed as songwriting geniuses following their disco reinvention, Paul reportedly told his band members that they were using the same 3 chords as everyone else. They had just sped them up and added a drum machine. While Paul never publicly attacked the Bee Gees, his conspicuous omission of them when discussing influential artists speaks volumes. Even during a 2001 tribute following Maurice Gibbs' death, McCartney's statement was notably brief and impersonal compared to other artists' heartfelt condolences, suggesting the competitive wounds never fully healed. The Beach Boys. The most intense musical rivalry of Paul McCartney's career wasn't with punk rockers or stadium rock competitors. It was with America's sunshine pop pioneers, the Beach Boys. What began as mutual admiration between McCartney and Brian Wilson evolved into a bitter creative feud that music insiders still discuss decades later. Legendary producer Phil Spector noted that Paul and Brian were like 2 chess grandmasters. Each move one made, the other had to top. It started friendly but turned into an obsession for both of them. The rivalry ignited after McCartney heard Pet Sounds in 1966. According to Beatles producer George Martin, Paul was both inspired and threatened. He played it constantly, analyzing every note. Then he would say they needed to go further than that, which directly led to Sgt. Pepper's. What truly soured the relationship was the abandoned Smile album. When Wilson shelved his masterpiece amid mental health struggles, McCartney was allegedly dismissive. Beatles roadie Mal Evans recalled Paul saying that if you couldn't finish what you started, you shouldn't be in the business. They pushed through no matter what. The tension peaked during a disastrous 1967 dinner party at Brian Wilson's home. McCartney reportedly criticized several Beach Boys songs as simplistic and suggested their harmonies were predictable. According to Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson, Paul left thinking he had given helpful feedback, but Brian didn't speak for days afterward. Over decades, the rivalry morphed into something colder. When asked about the Beach Boys' influence in a 1993 interview, McCartney conspicuously minimized their impact. He said they did lovely harmonies, but he thought people overstated how much they influenced the Beatles. The Beatles were already well on their way. Even in recent years, when discussing God Only Knows, a song he has called perfect, McCartney can't resist adding qualifiers like for American pop music or of that period, revealing a competitive edge that time hasn't dulled. As Beach Boys historian David Leaf put it, Paul respects Brian's work, but he'll never fully acknowledge how much it pushed him. That would mean admitting someone else drove the Beatles' evolution. These musical rivalries show a different side of Paul McCartney than most fans know. Behind the diplomatic public image was a fiercely competitive musician who had strong opinions about his contemporaries. Whether these feuds were about creative differences, personality clashes, or simple professional jealousy, they reveal that even musical legends have their nemeses. These tensions shaped not only McCartney's career, but also influenced some of the greatest music ever made, as competition often pushed all these artists to reach new creative heights.